Article 6 is a provision of the United Nations Charter which allows for the expulsion of any member state which has persistently violated the principles of the UN Charter. So it's essentially it's a measure that's intended to defend the principles of the Charter and to ensure adherence to those values and to those principles of the UN Charter by all members. You know, if you have an organization, there's supposed to be rules. There's supposed to be rules for membership, criteria, codes of conduct, and so on, which, if not adhered to, will result in expulsion from that organization. Well, the UN has those rules, and it has a mechanism for expulsion, and that mechanism is Article 6. So our objective is to see to it that Article 6 is invoked against the United States for its persistent violations of the principles of the United Nations Charter. So this is not only a campaign serving to achieve the practical matter of actually expelling the United States, the most persistent violator, from the UN, but it's also trying to uphold and affirm the principles that the U.S. persistently violates, showing that we actually take those values seriously. We actually take the United Nations purpose seriously. We take international law seriously, and so on. And we want to see all of these things, these institutions, and so on, and the mission of the United Nations, we want to see it operate functionally. And as long as the United States remains immune from the consequences of its violations, as long as the U.S. is allowed to flout the rules of the UN, as long as they're allowed to flout the principle of the rule of law, then that institution, the United Nations, and its principles, the principles it's supposed to stand for, are nothing but a parody. It's nothing but a satire and a mockery of the principles that are laid out in the UN Charter. Of course, the impetus of this campaign was the persistent vetoes by the U.S. against a ceasefire in Gaza. But it also comes from the realization, after following the situation in Palestine and this conflict for over 30 years, that this is an American-made conflict. It's an American-perpetuated conflict, and it has become an American-sponsored genocide. And this has always been in defiance of the entire world, been in defiance of the global consensus. And America has been able to do that because of its position in the United Nations and specifically because of its position on the United Nations Security Council, wherein it has the power to veto the entire unanimous opinion of the rest of the world. So yes, the impetus for our campaign is the situation in Gaza. But just a cursory glance of the record of the United States over the past 75 years, we can identify dozens upon dozens of violations of the UN Charter committed by the United States. Violations of the rules of the United Nations, violations of international law. There's been more violations by the United States than the number of years that the United Nations has existed. So the basis of the Article 6 campaign is what any objective, reasonable person would characterize as American persistence in its violations. It's absolutely undeniable. The rules of the United Nations exist for a reason. These rules exist for a reason. These principles are supposed to be upheld for a reason. And the reason is peace and security, the peace and security of the world. So if you care about peace and security in the world, then you should care about whether or not the U.S. is in or out of the United Nations. Because as long as the U.S. is in the United Nations, well, they threaten the peace and security of the planet, and they ensure nothing but war and insecurity. In my opinion, it's very hypocritical, or else shamefully naive, for anyone to pretend that they care about peace, that they care about justice, that they care about Gaza, or they care about Palestine, or that they care about international law, or what have you, if they are completely ignoring the number one saboteur, the number one opposer, the number one impediment to any of these priorities or any of these values or issues ever being dealt with in any kind of beneficial or moral way. Why it's impossible for me to take you seriously. If you talk about justice in the world, if you talk about peace in the world, or you talk about ending genocide or what have you, but you're fine with the United States sitting in the United Nations Security Council, or even if you're fine with them continuing to even be a member of the United Nations with the kind of criminal rap sheet that they have.